Mention phonics to anyone in education, and you tend to kickstart a debate as to whether it should or should not be taught. It's a debate that has raged for so long that we neglect an arguably more important discussion. Most schools are already doing phonics, so how best should it be done? To answer this question and more, I spoke to Julia Carroll, Professor in the Centre for Global Learning, Education and Attainment at Coventry University and an expert in phonics. Julia, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So phonics is quite a controversial topic, and the discussion seems to centre almost always on, do we do phonics or do we not? When actually every school I've ever visited, and my understanding is every school does teach phonics, because the policy is set up that way, and it's generally agreed in the UK at least that it's the way to teach reading. Is it important that we actually move on from that discussion now and we instead look at, okay, how are we teaching phonics and what are we teaching in phonics?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you say, pretty much all schools in the UK teach using phonics now, and we've known for at least 20 years that phonics is the most effective way to teach early reading and early literacy, and the government guidance has been pretty consistent on that as well. It's very explicit and very specific that we should be teaching phonics fast and first, so right from early reception, and we should be using the systematic synthetic phonics approach. And now we have the Year 1 phonics screen at the end of Year 1, which means that teachers and students are having that kind of assessment on whether they've had that phonics education. So yeah, I think we really need to move on and talk about how we can best teach phonics and how phonics fits into other elements of reading as well. Definitely.
What are the sort of key phonics approaches? And everyone knows synthetic phonics, but that's not the only option, is it?
No, traditionally there's been a division between synthetic phonics and analytic phonics. The idea is with analytic phonics that it's less systematic, so children would be still taught letter sounds and taught that words are made up of letter sounds, but there might be particular focus on recognizing words by the first few letter sounds and then kind of guessing from then on. And there's also a lot more emphasis on things like rhyming words and looking for words that sound similar because they have the same first sound, or words that sound similar because they rhyme. So you're learning about kind of different phonetic relationships, whereas synthetic phonics really tries to focus in on what you really need to know to sound out words, to spell those early words and read those early words. So traditionally, people have used quite an analytic approach, and it lends itself to mixing in lots of different types of lessons, whereas synthetic phonics feels like quite directed and typed kind of form of phonics, really.
It's like a discrete lesson. I mean, most schools will teach phonics as a subject in itself, I guess, if you can term it that way. And
yeah,
is there any, because schools will buy in programs almost always for these things. Like, there's some very popular ones, there's some less popular ones, there's ones teachers have even developed themselves. Is there a great deal of variation between synthetic phonics programs? Because if we take it that synthetic phonics is the main approach in schools, which I believe it is there a great deal of variation between a Jolly Phonics and a Ruth Miskin phonics program, for example?
I think not compared to the kind of variability that you get in probably in most other areas of the curriculum and in different countries. So the government's set out a series of guidelines on what synthetic phonics programs should include, and those are quite explicit, and the main programs that people use, so the Ruth Miskin's Read Write Ink, Floppy Phonics and Jolly Phonics and so on, I'm sure I'll miss some out, but the main schemes that you would use are have very similar kind of focus. The idea is that you introduce a few letters, teach kids those letters, and then start teaching them how to segment and blend using those letters. And then you introduce more letters as you go on. One of the main differences is how many letter sound combinations are taught. So there's more than one sound. Letters can make more than one sound, and obviously there's letter combinations and so on. So there are some schemes that teach more rarer combinations, and some that really focus on the most common ones. But to be honest, they have a lot of similarities, I think. So long as you follow the guidance in the schemes, then they're going to be similar and have quite similar outcomes. In terms of how much teachers follow all the guidance and all the different parts of the schemes, that's probably more variable. But
I was going to say, actually, I mean, if it's a bit like a conversation we're having about TAs actually with Professor Rob Webster, and he said, you know, TA-led interventions work really well when you do exactly the prescription of the research done. I mean, is it similar with phonics where the scheme you use isn't as crucial perhaps as following them to the letter, and the research is that proving, you know, when we say research finds phonics is the best approach, or are you saying phonics done this way, you have to do it a very specific way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rob Webster's really good at pointing out some of the differences between research and practice. And what happens in research studies is generally you say to the teachers, you have to teach this in this way, we want you to go through this amount of content. So when we say phonics works, we mean if you follow this to the letter. And obviously teachers want to add their own personality and their own stamp. I think the thing with the systematic synthetic phonics is as soon as you start going away from the manuals, it starts to be less systematic, and you start to it can make it less effective because it makes it more difficult. So I think one thing, I was listening to your podcast with David Epstein about kind learning environments and wicked learning environments, and I was thinking that one thing that phonics does is kind of limit the learning environment to quite a kind learning environment, so that you are teaching the child how to sound out words that they can sound out. And when you start going off the scheme and trying out different things, you're not limiting the environment in that same kind of way, and that can be counterproductive for children. So there's lots of places in which we do want teachers obviously to add their own personality and so on, but phonics schemes are probably not so much. It's a very structured system for a reason, because it kind of creates the kind learning environment early on, I think.
Do we know, is there any research on how variable the phonics teaching can be in schools? I mean, I imagine the phonics screening test check is a poor proxy to understand variability in teaching, because it's too noisy, I guess, with all the variables inherent in that. But do we know how much variability there is
in UK schools?
Yeah.
I don't think we do really. I mean, I think there's some variability in terms of individual teachers, but I think having the phonics screen and having those mandated programs means there's much less variability than there was in the past, and certainly much less variability than there is in most English-speaking countries.
And how does it work? I mean, with differentiation as well, because obviously kids are going to come into reception with very different knowledge of phonics, and they're probably going to naturally, as well as other fact environmentally, move at different pace through that reception year in terms of their phonics. And how can we ensure that, you know, a child that's is taught to their stage, or is it even, should it always be whole class? How does it work in the research? Do you tend to take a group and teach them as a whole class teaching through the process, or does differentiation occur?
Well, research-wise, I think differentiation does show better improvements, and I think that's probably, again, because phonics is such a systematic process. Before you start putting together words with 4 sounds, you have to be able to put together words with 2 sounds. So you have to work at that child's individual level, really. And so phonics is one of those areas where small group teaching with children, pushing them on from the level they're at, seems to be the most effective factor. So often schools will use whole group teaching to maybe introduce a new letter sound, talk about some sounds and relationships, and then we'll use the small groups to reinforce that and work at the level of the individual children, so that the more able children can be using more complex words and using a wider variety of words, and the less able children can be supported to do the less complex words, and everyone can move along. And one of the nice things about phonics is there is lots of research, and so we do know that those kind of, having that small group does seem to move children along through the phonics system faster for all levels. So sometimes, as possibly Rob Webster will have mentioned to you, sometimes the differentiation causes more individual difference in a classroom, that the brightest kids really get on, but the weakest kids really fall behind. But actually, it seems like in phonics, all the groups do better by having a bit of differentiation.
I wonder why that is. I mean, are the groups more flexible, do you think, or is it?
Yeah.
I don't know how. Why might it be the exception? I guess.
I think because you have to. Well, I think small group work allows you to make sure that each child's engaged. So I guess with the younger kids with phonics, it would be quite easy for them to just not take in information and just
Coast
kind of
a bit,
yeah. Whereas if you've got a small group, you can ask each child individually, because you really want to hear them speak and say the words, to know that they understand. So I think small group allows you to be engaged with the children. I think it allows you to move each child on to their next step in terms of learning, and in comparison to individual work, I think it also allows them to see peers at a similar level, and get feedback from them, and it also makes it more engaging. I think individual teaching can be quite daunting for little ones, and it's obviously very labour intensive for teachers. So yeah, it seems like for this age group, the small group is ideal.
Does it help? I mean, it brings me on to my next question, which is, does it help as well to identify the kids who've just read widely and been read widely to at home, who may look like they're sounding out words, but actually they've just memorized the word, and so they're not actually, it's not that the performance is fake, I guess, but they're not actually using the phonetic approach, and they're actually sort of, they're sort of, what's the best way of putting it? I don't want to say they're lying, but their performance looks like it's above where it might be phonetically.
Yeah, certainly there's some children who come to school and know some of their favourite storybooks off by heart, and it can look like they can read them, whereas they've actually just memorised them, and it can be hard to tell in a large group, or they can be looking like they're flying through the reading, and that can be difficult for parents as well. It can feel like you're making the child take a backward step by going into the phonics, but really teaching the phonics stages gives them a really good foundation for moving further, because obviously they're not going to be able to memorize texts forever.
No, exactly.
Yeah, and so the small group work does help you pick that out, I think, and to react to the individual child.
I guess that takes us to the next point, is where where phonics is seen as done. There's this
Yeah.
notion, isn't there, of, if you pass your phonics screening check, I mean, is phonics over then? I mean, have you completed it, as they say in computer games world? Or, at what point does phonics become less of a discrete lesson and more of a background tool, if you like, that may be
Yeah.
taught on the spot when necessary?
The government guidance is that phonics teaching should be fast and first, and then there's not so much guidance about when phonics should stop so much. So as you say, the idea is that by the year one phonics screen, hopefully children have that level of phonics to be able to read and work out simple words and non-words. And if the children fail that year one phonics screen, then they should be getting some additional phonics work in year two. But often year two and year three is when you really see a change in the characteristics of readers, and you start to see them really being able to be a bit more independent. And if their phonics teaching has worked and they've taken on that phonics teaching, they're able to sound out new words for themselves and work out new words, and they can, and if they've got the kind of core of sight words as well, they can read the majority of texts that they're placed in front of them. And that means that you can hopefully step back from the phonics work and start working more on things like reading comprehension. But I think, as you said, the idea of having phonics in the background is a good idea. So traditionally people have talked about when children are reading books to encourage them to use multiple cues to try and work out unknown words. But we now know that phonics is the most effective way of working out unknown words. And it doesn't always work, but it's the method that children should try first. So you're not necessarily teaching them explicit phonics rules in class so much, but you are encouraging them to use their phonics knowledge all the time when they're reading and spelling.
It's interesting about spelling is that I guess by year three, year two, year three, we're getting a focus on spelling. In all the written work, and the kids are writing longer pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some who say, well, phonics isn't very helpful for that. Phonics is actually detrimental when we get to that shift. So I guess it's a two-pronged question: is there any truth in that? Firstly, but also if you are continuing a phonics approach, an active teaching approach of phonics in year 2 and 3, is that getting in the way of your teaching of spelling?
What I'd ideally like teachers to think about is how they transfer from a phonics focus to a focus that introduces other kinds of knowledge about words. So it can sometimes be that people talk about phonically regular words or irregular words, and tricky words, they're often called, that there are some words you can sound out and there are some words you can't sound out, and you just shouldn't bother trying. It seems like you should just try and remember them. And as you get to years 2 and 3, you get more and more of those words, but often those words are not, well, they're hardly ever completely irregular. Normally they have some letter sounds that are correct. So you can sound out part of them. Often they've also, there are other characteristics that you can use to try and help you remember the spelling. So they might have what we call morphological structure. So for example, the word mist could be spelt M-I-S-S-E-D if it's a past tense, or M-I-S-T if it's a weather description. So once you've taught children about the sound structure of speech, you need to start teaching them about the other kinds of structures that occur, the meaning structures and the grammatical structures like ed endings. And I think that's really the next stage of phonics. You shouldn't think that you're getting rid of phonics, you're adding to it and expanding to it by showing how the system goes beyond phonics, really.
So not seeing phonics as a catch-all as well. It seems
Yeah,
to be what you're saying.
exactly.
Like
Yeah,
phonics really is the your foundation stone, and then
yeah,
that's not all you need, and you shouldn't be viewed as I've completed reading when you've just done phonics. There's other tools there.
yeah, yeah. So it's a, as you say, it's a foundation stone. Other tools build on phonics, um, but phonics is always going to be part of the picture. Well, we know that the children who learn and remember words best are the ones who remember the phonics connections within those words. So even if you're not sounding out words, recognizing them efficiently involves your phonics skills. So keeping the children using their phonics skills is valuable for helping them to learn to read efficiently, as well as sounding out unknown words.
How does it relate to when a child will read aloud? And I'm just thinking of my 7-year-old who seems to read quite happily on his own with the age appropriate books, but he'll read something out loud, and you'll hear some of the tricky words or the irregular words you talk about, especially multisyllable words, where he'll sound them more difficult. You sound them wrongly, but incorrectly, if you
Mm-hmm.
like. And unless he sounds those out to me, I'll never know that in his head he's reading them in that way. Is that, how do we guard against that? I mean, one of the things you want to talk about was how phonics relates to multisyllable words.
Yeah.
Is that part of that process? Do we need to have kids reading aloud more to identify those discrepancies?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that it's still really useful to have those year 2, year 3, year 4 children reading aloud to pick out those kinds of words, because often children can learn to recognize a word and learn its meaning, but they don't necessarily know how to pronounce it. Uh, I think there's a whole set of rules around reading multisyllabic words which aren't taught very explicitly in UK schools around. So once we get to multiple syllables, we tend to have a pattern of alternating stressed and unstressed syllables, which linguists know about and know about how that relates to the letters within the words, but I think teachers don't necessarily know about. So often the things that are hardest to spell are those unstressed syllables. So in words like record or despair or something, that first vowel sound just is kind of a sound.
Yeah.
And children don't know whether it should be an E or an I or an A or what. And part of that is because of how, when we create multisyllabic words, we change the stress in them. And so that would be something that I would like to see taught much more explicitly in schools. And that goes beyond the synthetic phonics, because that's looking at how word structure changes the phonics within words.
And the word like indestructible, like if I'm a teacher saying that with my accent and maybe a different teacher with a different accent,
Mm.
and the child can read that word, but how they, again, back to the pronunciation, it's quite, working with my own children and helping them with their homework, I was very conscious that my accent shifted how they might spell that word or how they might read it, even like indie or indestructible. And you
Yeah.
suddenly find yourself breaking down words. It's an incredibly bizarre experience. But is there anything, what you're talking about, those rules around and the stressed and unstressed syllables, can that cut through a bit of that noise of accent and pronunciation?
It can a bit, yes. And with a word like indestructible, what really kind of helps you to work out the unstressed syllables is working out the units within the word. So with it, indestructible is a really nice example, actually, because it's got an in prefix, and then it's got destruct in the middle, and then it's got an able suffix. And
I hadn't
so
thought of it that way. Yeah.
so once you start breaking it down like that, and then you can start thinking, well, destruct is related to destroy, actually. That's and so the DE sounding is possibly slightly clearer in destroy.
I think the destroy thing was useful actually, because it indestructible rather than destructible. With a Portsmouth accent, it sounds like is, and it's actually spelt s, indestructible. So I guess there's just being conscious of those things as a teacher, and even if even if, use my example again, even if your teacher's got a Portsmouth accent and so have the kids, it's still important from a reading perspective to have that conversation about how you've broken the word down like you just did. And that, I think that's a really useful tool.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of accents, I think most kids are quite good at matching across different accents and kind of working out the similarities and differences. There are some words like bath and path that are quite different, and so if you're in the southern half of the country, you might get children spelling it with an AR spelling, and if you're in the northern half of the country, you'd be more likely to get a single A spelling. So there is some differences like that where it can be more difficult, but I think for the most part, where it's just differences of degrees, children are pretty good at being quite flexible and working it out.
And if you go back to when we stopped phonics, and we said it's part of a patchwork of skills that we should always be mindful of. But if a child is consistently not progressing with a phonics approach, and at what age, what's the expected progress, and at what age do you think, okay, well, are there what else is going on here? I mean, phonics is an identification tool, if you like, for different issues or different challenges that child may be having.
Yeah, absolutely. If a child's not past the phonics screen, then they should really be coming to their teacher's attention as someone who might need extra support in year 2. And if they're still having real difficulties with phonics, then they're likely to need more individualized support. And these are the children who tend to show dyslexic profile, or sometimes also children who've got speech and language difficulties. So I think it's really worthwhile with those children to try and look at what particular strengths and weaknesses they have and try and work with that. Certainly, one of the downsides of the focus on phonics is that you get older children and adults saying that people have tried to teach them phonics for years and years, and they hate it, and no one's ever tried another approach. So I think certainly you do need to, at some point, you need to think of other skills as well as phonics, and often that's to do with broader language skills and trying to support building up vocabulary and building up knowledge in other areas. And those, looking at the meaning structure of words, can be useful in that as well. Certainly I wouldn't want a child who's having difficulties to just have to do phonics again and again. I think it can be useful to mix up with different kinds of skills. And
I guess I guess the illusion I was thinking of is like if you've got a sort of an assault course climbing thing you have to climb over, and you say, well, keep trying because eventually you're going to get over it. And there may be a tendency to view phonics in the same way. This isn't, reading is the obstacle, and getting over it is the phonics. It's getting fitter, and every child will get over it. But from what you just said, we shouldn't think of it like that every child can use phonics to hurdle the reading challenge, if you like.
Yeah, I would always say that phonics should be your first way of trying to hurdle the reading challenge. But I think also, I guess I wouldn't like to suggest to kids that reading is a hurdle they need to get over either. I think one of the nice things about phonics is that it's teaching them kind of the secret of reading. It's teaching them the code that they need to use to break down the words. So if they have a lot of trouble with the phonics code, you need to teach them other ways to try and break down that code. But you should always be trying to make it more of a mystery to be solved than a hurdle to overcome, I think, if possible.
I think that's very nice, actually. That's a very nice analogy. It's like a, demystifying reading is a much more exciting prospect, I guess, than the challenge. And I guess the last question I'd like to ask is that journey of phonics, is it made more complex because most of the people who will now be, well, not most, but I guess anyone over 30 probably wouldn't have experienced phonics themselves as a way of reading, or would have had not as established approach. Is it going to get easier when we have a generation who've been through it, that some of these debates around phonics will stop because they won't know any different, if you like?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's true with teachers and with parents at the moment that a lot of them didn't go through phonics teaching themselves, so don't necessarily see the value and the positives about it, or don't necessarily see how to do it most effectively. But yeah, in a few years, most parents will have been through phonics teaching themselves, I think, and perhaps most teachers. And I think that really will make it move the debate on, as you said at the start, and it will make it easier for people. Though I do think it's interesting, as an aside, how much phonics people forget as well. So you get taught about phonics early on, and even in year 4 and 5, children have moved away from phonics being their primary way of reading, and will be much more focused on letters than the actual sounds within the words. So just an example, my 8-year-old had a argument with me the other day about the names James and George, and I said James and George start with the same sound, and she said not really, they sound a bit different to me. But phonetically, they are the same sound. They're spelt with a different letter. But even children get quite focused on letters rather than the kind of phonetic sounds relatively early on.
It's a good lesson for a reminder, a refresher, if you like, that phonics doesn't go away, and we should keep reminding. And that healthy arguments with 8-year-olds are always fun, right?
Don't know, you never win an argument with my 8-year-old. So.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, Julia. That was great.
Thank you.